Back in the mid-1990s, I was living in Mexico when the filmmaker John Sayles came through to shoot a film called Men with Guns. It was set against the backdrop of civil war in an unnamed Latin American country, and the title referred to farming families who couldn't seem to get ahead because they kept getting visited by different groups of men with guns. They would come on different days, they would arrive from different directions, they had different agendas, but the end result of those visits was almost always the same: to destroy what farming families were trying to build and to keep them from getting on with the business of farming. 20 years later, I find myself working in Colombia for CRS, leading the Borderlands Coffee Project in the Department of Nariño, where the Men with Guns script is still playing itself out. I took this photo on a farm visit last year. These particular men with guns are part of the Colombian army, and they were occupying this village to secure it for the arrival of a manual eradication team that was coming to tear out coca planted in a field that looked like this. There are coca fields like this all over the coffee lands in Nariño, and they're planted at the behest of another group of men with guns. The guerrilla will arrive in a community, make its presence felt, commit some acts of violence, and then at gunpoint suggest that growers can find a little room in their coffee fields to plant coca. These growers are quite literally caught in the crossfire. Now, there are echoes of this dynamic in the current conversation in Nariño about coffee varieties. One day, agronomists from the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros will arrive at a community and tell growers to plant Castillo. Several days later, buyers, relentlessly focused on cup quality, will arrive to that same village and tell those same growers not to plant Castillo, to stick with Caturra and other traditional varieties because they produce better quality in the cup. Now, these men, and they are mostly men, are not armed with guns. They're armed with varietal opinions. They're not threatening growers into planting the variety of their choice. They're offering incentives. What do the advocates of Castillo offer? They offer the promise of disease resistance and higher productivity, which is a very powerful proposition in a region that's been hit hard by coffee leaf rust. The Borderlands project I direct collected detailed baseline data, and as late as 2012, we saw that over 60% of growers in Nariño were still struggling to control coffee leaf rust on their farms. The advocates of Castillo also have another powerful tool in their advocacy, which is free money to plant Castillo. Colombia has arguably the best coffee renovation loan in the world. It has low interest rates, a long grace period, favorable repayment terms, and a federal subsidy worth 40% of the loan capital. And that's not something that the advocates of Caturra can offer, because that's available only for Castillo. What do Caturra advocates offer to growers like these? They offer a shot at the big leagues. Fully realized direct trading relationships with roasters who want the good stuff and are willing to pay price premiums for it. These people advocate for Caturra because they're convinced, based more on faith than reason, that Caturra is better in the cup than Castillo. So this is not an armed conflict, but it is unquestionably a tactical battle for territory, since one variety can only gain ground at the expense of the other, and Castillo is unquestionably winning the battle. Released in 2005, Castillo now represents almost 40% of Colombia's coffee lands. In 10 years, it's become the single most important variety in what is arguably the single most important country of origin for specialty coffee. And Nariño is no different. In that same baseline survey I mentioned, we included questions about varietal preferences and attitudes. We asked growers, the last time you renovated, what coffee did you plant? More than half of respondents said Castillo, fewer than 1 in 4 said Caturra. We also asked them, what will you plant the next time you renovate? Again, Castillo the big winner, Caturra the big loser. But far more interesting than what growers are planting is why. Growers who told us they were sticking with Caturra said first we're doing it because of productivity, and second, quality. 27% of respondents associated Caturra with quality. That may sound like an unimpressive number, but the growers who were planting Castillo, none of them mentioned quality. They associate Castillo exclusively or primarily with disease resistance and productivity. They also did mention in 3% of the cases access to this fantastic renovation loan. One grower told us, I'm going to plant Castillo because the bank makes you. So it is a simple question, Castillo or Caturra, but in Nariño that question has been fundamentally reframed as a question of quantity or quality. Why? Because the advocates of Castillo tend to focus on disease resistance and productivity as its principal selling points, and the advocates of Caturra talk about cup quality as its principal differentiator. That may be a false dichotomy. We don't know. Growers in Nariño can't afford to frame the question wrong because they have to get it right. They just don't have margin for error. We've got tiny farms. Nariño has one of the smallest average farm sizes in all of Colombia's coffee-producing departments. They have low production. Most of them are poor and hungry. And the decision they make today about what variety they're going to put in the ground will affect their families for 15 years to come. When we started nosing around in Nariño in late 2010, growers started asking us, what variety should we be planting? And we realized, to our chagrin, that we didn't have access to any better information than they did. But as the project rolled on, we realized that if we got together with friends in industry, in research, and in the donor community, we could give them a better and more informed answer. So the idea of the Colombia Sensory Trial was born. We had three modest objectives with this. Well, we had one modest objective, which was to improve decision-making processes at three levels. First, on the farm, where, as Tim Schilling put it so brilliantly, farmers just want to know which variety is going to give them the best bang for their buck. We couldn't answer that question. In the policymaking process, where the Castillo First policy of Colombia's coffee institutions has contributed in important ways to Castillo's rise and Caturra's demise. And in the marketplace, where there has been a persistent rejection of the idea that Castillo can produce cup quality. So we went out and we recruited for our jury some of the best people we know in specialty from some of the most important coffee organizations in the world. Starbucks, the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros, Curie, Green Mountain, Stumptown Intelligentsia, Counterculture, Red Fox, and George Howell. We enlisted Paul Songer as the judge, a veteran of countless COE competitions. In the research community, we deepened our relationship with CIAT, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Colombia, and started a new relationship with World Coffee Research with the support of its executive committee. And for funding, we reached out to our longtime partner in the coffee lands, the Howard G. Buffett Foundation, which has quietly invested almost $25 million in specialty coffee projects in Africa and Latin America. The biggest constraints on the design were not in the field, but they're in the lab. With cuppers of that caliber, we realized we couldn't really ask for their free labor for more than 3 days at a time, so we had to work back from that constraint. The economists at CIAT told us that we couldn't do fewer than 2 repetitions and hope to generate any kind of statistical power with our analysis, and we decided not to present more than 40 samples a day to avoid incurring the kind of error that is due to cupper fatigue. So with those 3 key constraints, we realized we could only include 25 farms in the process. That's 25 sample pairs of Castillo and Caturra grown from the same farms. That is, by the way, the original sin in the design of the project. With that small sample size, we were not able to generate the kind of generalizable results to be able to say that what we found here is statistically significant or robust. So keep that in mind as you see the results later. We also decided to do 2 panels rather than 1. This was to test the idea that one variety may fade faster than another. On the farm, we looked for farms that fulfilled some basic criteria. First, obviously, they had to be growing Castillo and Caturra. Those varieties had to be grown under similar agroecological conditions, and they needed to be managed, harvested, and processed in identical ways. We also needed growers who were willing and able to maintain strict separation of the 2 varieties throughout the process. And we partnered with a local university to train farmers in that and to help us monitor compliance throughout the process. For each sample, we collected detailed data on all these variables to aid in the analysis. And we cupped each sample 3 times, twice with our project team on the ground in Nariño and once in Bogota with Virmax, which handled all logistics and export for the process. Through that process, we eliminated 3 sample pairs that presented some defects or fruitiness that was attributable to processing and might have clouded the analysis. So we entered the panels with 22 samples. We had 2 panels, one in early October and one in mid-January in the Intelligentsia Coffee Works in Chicago. I know Intelligentsia is out there. Thank you very much, Intelli, for that. Before I get to the results, a few more grains of salt. I mentioned the idea of the small sample size. It's important also to remember that the results of this trial can't tell you anything about the inherent capabilities of these 2 varieties planted anywhere outside of Colombia. They can't even tell you what Castillo and Caturra are capable of outside of Nariño. Seni Café has developed a series of regional Castillo varieties. These cultivars are optimized for growing conditions in different regions of Colombia. So this doesn't go beyond Nariño, and in fact, it doesn't go beyond the 2014 harvest. The 2015 harvest that's coming up is a whole new ballgame. We have to reset. So keep that in mind as you look at the results. And before you do that, I'm going to present some spider graphs, which I think everybody's familiar with. I'm also going to present some box and whisker graphs, which may be less familiar. So a quick tutorial on the box and whisker graph. Your eyes will be drawn to the colored box in the middle. That represents the middle 50% of all observations. The whiskers that come from the bottom and top of that box are the top and bottom 25% of all observations, and then any outliers are those little dots above or below those whiskers that didn't fit in that spread. The median is the line across the middle of the box, and the mean is the number that I've put in. So how did they do? Round 1 went to Castillo. The mean score was 1/100th of 1 point higher than the average score for Caturra. What else do we see? Well, we see that the Castillo box is a lot smaller. It was a much more consistent performer in a narrow band. So 50% of all observations were spread over just barely over 1 point. It had a lower variance than Caturra. Caturra has a bigger box, more of a spread. What we see also is that although the total range, the distance between the top score and bottom score of Castillo is very similar to the top and bottom scores of Caturra, we see that the variance is higher in Caturra because the upper and lower scores for Castillo are outliers. Castillo was more consistent around that mean. Round 2 went to Caturra by a half point. The mean score was 1/2 of 1 point higher. What do we see here? Well, we see both varieties have a greater variance, a greater range, and that I think is natural. These were stored in grain pro bags for 3 months under good conditions, but the coffees start to fade and destabilize over time. We see both coffees with a greater range, and we see Caturra's lower 25% not performing as well as Castillo's. And the total was that Caturra was 3/10 of 1 point higher in its mean score than Castillo. None of these results are statistically significant. We also did 2 panels, again, to test whether there are different rates of fade with the 2 varieties. And you see Castillo lost almost a 1/2 point from round 1 to round 2, while Caturra's mean score actually increased by less than 1/10 of 1 point. It may be tempting on the basis of those results to conclude that one variety fades faster than another. But look at Caturra's range and look at its lower range. Again, those results are not statistically significant. So on the basis of this data, there was no evidence of any difference in sensory quality between Castillo and Caturra. We also found no evidence of any difference in the rates at which the sensory quality of Castillo and Caturra fade. We found something similarly inconclusive when we looked at each of the sensory categories. We asked cuppers to evaluate these coffees over 7 sensory categories, and in 3 of them, sweetness, body, and acidity was a dead heat. In the other 4, overall fragrance, flavor, and aftertaste, there was a razor-thin preference for Caturra, not statistically significant. So again, on the basis of this data, there was no difference between Castillo and Caturra in any specific sensory category. So we're looking through the data, trying to find separation. Is there anything that we can find? We were mindful throughout that we had very different companies and organizations participating in this process. On the right-hand side of the line, we have companies or organizations that buy more than 1 million bags of coffee a year. On the left, companies that don't. So for analytical purposes, we divided these into 2 categories, high-volume specialty channel and the specialty channel, to see whether there were differences there. And again, that's what we saw. Specialty gave higher scores across the board than high-volume specialty. Both channels had a slight preference for Caturra. Both channels scored Castillo more consistently in a narrow band, more variance or range for Caturra. None of the results statistically significant. But these are just means, right? We wondered, are there patterns of preference that emerge? So for each of the tables, we had 8 to 10 samples on each table, 4 or 5 sample pairs. So 4 or 5 farms were represented on each table. We did not want to separate those sample pairs and put the Castillo in the morning and the Caturra in the afternoon. We wanted to have them when the cupper was at his or her same level of acuity. And so we had 4 or 5 decision points per table 7 or 8 cuppers per table, up to 40 decision points per table. Over the 2 panels, that yielded 628 decisions where there was a preference for one variety over the other. But there were no pronounced patterns of preference. It was split almost as evenly down the middle as possible. The cuppers preferred Caturra 8 times more than they preferred Castillo, over 628 decisions. And again, there was no real difference between the 2 channels and their preferences. The specialty channel, over 356 decisions, only 2 times more did it prefer Castillo than Caturra, and with high-volume specialty, 6 times more, over 272 decisions. On the basis of that, we can say there was no evidence of difference in preferences between specialty and high-volume specialty companies. So what? So what? For practitioners like me and many of you in the audience who are not researchers, the most important research question is always, so what? What does it mean? For us specifically in the context of the decisions that we were trying to inform, what does it mean for decisions being made on the farm? It is very hard on the basis of this evidence to argue in any passionate way for Caturra, because it obligates growers to assume a significant level of production risk without increasing in any statistically significant way the probability of producing a higher cup score, and, more importantly, accessing the premiums associated with higher cup scores. Similarly, in the policymaking process, it's very hard to argue with Colombia's Castillo First policy on the basis of these results. And in the marketplace, the most important contribution of this research may be to show that Castillo can be good. It can even be very good. George Howell did not participate in the panels, but he cupped some of the sample pairs in his lab, and he told me that he was expecting to taste in the Castillo samples what he calls the tail of the devil. You have complex flavor, bright acidity, juicy fruit, and then you get whipped by the tail of the devil, what he called the trademark astringency of Castillo, and he simply did not taste it in these samples. He told me he couldn't tell me which one he thought was better. He couldn't even tell which one was which. So the roasters in this process, a lot of them who expected Caturra to perform better, told me they were relieved that Castillo outperformed their expectations. And I said, why? Well, they're growing pretty skeptical of the claims of 100% Caturra varietal lots. As Castillo continues its march through Colombia's coffee lands, it's harder and harder to imagine that people can keep it out of the coffee. So they said, we know we have to buy Castillo anyway. We're happy that it's good. So I think there are probably some people in the audience who are going, yeah, okay, I didn't taste these, but I know I prefer Caturra. I just know it. And if you think that, that's fine. That's fine. I would offer 2 pieces of advice. Be sure and pay more. This is what preference looks like. Out of the 8 companies who participated in this process, only 2 had statistically significant preferences for one variety over another. This is one of them. This is a specialty roaster who had, as you can see, over all 7 sensory categories, an unambiguous preference for Caturra over Castillo. This roaster does pay more. This roaster told me it would be willing to pay 60 cents per pound more for separated Caturra varietal lots. Is that good? I don't know. We don't know where the market's going to be, but more importantly, we can't quantify the risk that a grower takes when he or she plants Caturra. This year they may have no productivity loss, next year maybe 20%, maybe 75%. How do you incorporate that into the pricing decision? Is that 60 cents per pound a risk premium, or is that a quality premium? The point I'm trying to make is, if you're out there and you think you're sure you prefer Caturra, then you need to fundamentally rethink the incentives that you're creating for it. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, we're working right now with growers in Nariño to separate out single variety Caturra lots. Why? Because we're working with roasters who are sure that they prefer Caturra and are willing to pay more. So these are growers who have been growing Caturra and Castillo for a long time, and for the first time, they're getting financial incentives to separate out their Caturra. It's a little bit more labor and a significant upside. Anybody who's in one of these standing trading relationships and is able to deliver mutual value through commitment to a particular variety, that makes sense to keep doing that. It's not inconsistent with the results of this. But this particular lot, which was sold by Counterculture, was grown by 33 farmers. There are 38,000 farmers in Nariño and over 500,000 in Colombia. If you think you want Caturra, you have to make the market signal stronger, and you have to hold it longer. The decisions that growers are making today about what variety they're going to put in the ground, those coffees aren't even going to come to market for 3 to 4 years, and then they'll be on the market for 10 to 12 years after that. The market needs to send a clear, strong, concerted signal that they want those varieties, and they need to price them right if they want growers to plant them. In the end, Castillo, why is Castillo 40% of Colombia's coffee lands? It's in part a reflection of the success of the policies of Colombia's coffee institutions. And it's in part a reflection of the failure of the market to create the appropriate incentives for the varieties it thinks it wants. Growers, policymakers, buyers will all contribute to determining the varietal composition of Colombia's coffee lands. But in my mind, the most important and powerful actor in that is the marketplace through the incentives it sends or doesn't. I just want to say thank you. Thank you. I forgot one thing. We did learn one other thing that is important to share. A lot of you know this guy. It's Tim Hill, QC Director and Green Coffee Buyer for Counterculture Coffee. And as I was poring over the data from round one, I was really struck by the variability. We had cuppers who preferred, during one repetition, Castillo and the next Caturra. Their scores varied from one repetition to the next, sometimes by not inconsiderable amounts. And I said, Tim, why is that? And he said, oh yeah, cuppers are terrible. And as instruments of sensory analysis, I think he's probably right. I think we've known for a long time that the dominant mode of evaluating coffee quality is deeply flawed. And we haven't until now had any alternatives. World Coffee Research applied, I think for the first time ever, to these samples, the new sensory lexicon, and was able to succeed where cuppers failed in finding statistically significant, consistent differences between the two coffees. They weren't able to tell us which one was better, but they were able to tell us how they were different. In other words, they were able to correlate high cupping scores with specific qualitative attributes in statistically significant ways. They were able to tell us, in other words, that a good Castillo and a good Caturra are both good, but they're different. A good Castillo, they say, and these are not cuppers, these are what Tim Schilling affectionately calls human machines. They tell us that a good Castillo is fruity but not citric. It has dark chocolate and roasted nut notes, while a good Caturra is floral with notes of cocoa and caramel. I know that's a terrible tease. I get to the end and I tell you, oh, there is actually a difference, but I just got this information yesterday, and we will be fleshing this information out. It will be part of the final report, so stay tuned. Now you may applaud. Thank you.